One Night in Old Mexico, written and narrated by Jake Sanders, a submission for the People's Friend Short Story Competition 2024. Unit 821, suspected gunshots heard at Paseos Moreles. The voice blared over the soft hum of the engine. Jaime watched Guzman lean in towards the radio, his wide mustachioed lips pressed forward as though to kiss it. Dispatch, Unit 821 is on scene. Stand by. The car crackled over the dirt road, coming to a halt in one of the shadows. The creak of the handbrake as it clicked into place ushered in a silence. Was it here? He asked suddenly. Yes, assured Guzman, almost whispering. The last apartment block, about a week ago. Whole den of them. Jaime noticed he would not even look in the direction he was referencing, never mind point towards it. 14 million. That's what they told me at the station. I still can't believe it, he said, mimicking his superior's hushed tone. All family as well, continued Guzman. Apparently one of them was even getting married a week next Wednesday, to one of Lopez's girls, some cousin of Vicente's or something. Yeah, that's what they were telling me, Jaime replied excitedly. I guess they were planning for a big one then. What with all that money? Amazing to think, isn't it? All of it just over there in that tiny place. Guzman sighed deeply, as though releasing a slew of pain. She kept screaming, the mother, crying, begging to see them. Took us ages to clean out the place. I could do with just forgetting that morning. The lives he's destroyed, he said, his voice trailing off, though Jaime hung on to every word. They're just pieces to him. Pieces on a chessboard, Jaime reassured. You were doing your job, Nazario. Keeping innocent people safe. These people weren't. There's a difference. Guzman smiled, though only just. Jaime searched the wide almond eyes looking back into his. He'd never had much success befriending people. The youngest of three, he'd watched as his elderly parents were worn down by the responsibility of having to care for their incompetent sons. They were all gone now. At school, the teachers had despaired of him, admonishing his unsatisfactory grades whenever they could. One had even gripped him by the collar in the middle of class, shaking him violently over his chair. From then on, nobody had wanted anything to do with him, his status as a pariah sealed. Now, far from home, he could change all that. Guzman had become the closest thing to a brother he'd ever really had. He planned to keep it that way. Citizens report a theft outside a hardware shop on, Calle de la Varon, fizzed the voice once more. De la Varon? Isn't that near here? Asked Jaime. No, you're thinking of de la Baron, explained Guzman, smiling. That's the one just off the intersection, you know, where the old casino used to be. This other place is out towards Salita. Right, let's see what we've got here then, he said, his hands tapping the dashboard. What's going on around this happy little corner of the county? I mean, they're out for revenge, right? It has to be connected, surely, insisted Jaime. Could be, but with places like these, you can never be too... Stopping mid-sentence, Guzman dropped his head suddenly, peering into the upper half of the window screen. Jaime promptly followed suit. Squinting past the orange glare of the nearby streetlight, he could just about make them out. Hovering ominously in the air were two dark objects, circling each other as though locked in a ritualistic dance. They're over the cemetery, said Guzman, his words chilling every bone in Jaime's body. Then, as if hearing him, the objects swiftly vanished. Jaime quelled the pain in his parched throat, the noise of the gulp shaking him upright. What the hell was that? He asked loudly. Guzman fell back into his seat with a jolt, grabbing at the door handle. No, I'll go, Jaime said firmly, eager to impress. What? They were probably just vultures or something. I'll go and have a look. Besides, it's worth just checking to see what's about. Guzman sighed from under his police cap. Keep to the shadows. Jaime nodded. Stepping out of the car, the heat hit him with an intensity so out of sorts for this late in the evening. The air was stifling and buzzed with the noises of a cicada chorus which seemed to surround them. No signs of human activity, though, save for the burning scent of a distant wood fire. Scanning the apartment blocks, he saw no movement anywhere. Nothing stirred in the obsidian sea of fields which backed onto the neighbourhood, nor was there anything overhead. No sign of what had just occurred could be found. Not even a single cloud roamed the lonely black sky. Satisfied it was safe to continue, he proceeded to walk down the largely unlit side road, his shoes crunching in the dirt as he kept well clear of the tall reeds growing from the roadside. The closer he got, the quieter it became. There was no sound of chattering cicadas here. The cemetery gates remained firmly shut, the small bell tower overhead hanging still in the windless air. That he couldn't hear anything should have alleviated his nerves. It did not. Evading a stray cactus lodged within the gap in the pavement, he hoisted himself up the sloped steps. It seemed higher in elevation than it had appeared on the roadside. Somehow there was a breeze up here, though only slight. The metal gate was cool upon touch, flakes of rust from years of exposure coming off into his quivering hands. It couldn't move, even if now, with him stood there tugging at it. The struggle continued for several moments, sweat congregating in the creases of his neck as panic set in. Finally, after pulling with such force he worried the hinge had come off, whatever had wedged the gate shut gave way, releasing a shuddering groan. Jaime watched a short while before entering, using it to take in all that he had overcome in the brief yet stressful time it had taken to get up there. The path through the cemetery was backed on all sides by a row and row and row of mausoleums. In the dark, they appeared to form one singular block of stone, puncturing the night sky at varying heights. Save for the spaces surrounding the occasional headstone, the place possessed a labyrinthian compactness which bewildered the senses, no doubt a perfect place to hide. He shone his torch through each orifice and gap in the stonework, and when satisfied, progressed on to investigate further. A small chapel lay ahead, but he wasn't going in there. If it was anything like the one they'd had back home, it was somewhere to be avoided. Known as the Bone House, he had been horrified to discover that the name really described what it was, and that he hadn't been cruelly tricked by one of his father's antics. Turning a corner, he found more of the same, though here the cobbled path had mostly crumbled away, the remnants consumed by all manner of twisted vegetation. The more he looked, the more he saw how abandoned it was. Gnarled trees contorted themselves around the silent stone, and brambles found their way into every cranny. It seemed like the sort of area which would appear gloomily even in the daytime. How anybody could navigate their way around here was anyone's guess. Yet clearly someone had, though. Strewn flower petals, photographs and offerings dotted the graves of the entombed. He stepped in to look at one in particular. It almost looked new. A young girl, only 12, she had passed away in 1972. He could just about remember that year, mostly the summer and how quickly the fires had spread across the hillsides. A distinct feeling that he was being watched came over Jaime. He remained where he stood, motionless in the vain hope that by doing so, whatever it was would soon leave him alone. It was still there. The fluttering above him did not cease, but instead became ever more discernible. With rigid care, he lifted his head up to face it. The empty sky looked back at him mockingly. Had the vulture spotted an animal carcass among the graves? It was not unheard of for offerings to be made in the form of deceased creatures. His mother's stories of the bottled objects, laying in the rocks and crevices of the mountains to bring either fortune or misery to those captured inside, had always perplexed him. Ridiculous, really, as such things were merely folklore, and often involved a belief in... No, it definitely had nothing to do with them. Jaime marched swiftly past the corner and back into the main section of the cemetery, having not quite believed his own assurances. "Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee," he muttered under sharp breaths. The flesh around his nails stung with the pain of the rosary beads digging into his skin. He switched off his torch. If whoever it was had successfully distracted him away from the trouble brewing on the roadside, he would not give them the courtesy of knowing that he was about to go back down there. He heard it again, swooping overhead, and this time it was far more audible. He froze. So close as well, just a bit longer, then he'd been out of this sinister place. With just a brief glance to the right, he made the gravest of mistakes. There she was, a woman, draped in black. She was perched atop a mausoleum roof. Her hood drooped low, exposed a mass of scraggly hair from which two enormous, hate-filled eyes stared back at him. Jaime's face twitched wildly as his body jumped in fright, his legs hurling him towards the gate. Refusing to look back to see if she was still there, his fears were soon confirmed by the sound of a guttural screech. Jaime hit the ground with a thud, catching his knee on the bulbous cobbles. His hand, stinging from the impact, grabbed onto the nearest slippery stone as he heaved himself up and made for the gate. Grabbing it, he made contact with the ice-cold metal once more, fighting it to open with all his strength. In a moment of error, he turned again to check if the witch had followed. Sure enough, her form emerged from a nearby headstone, closer than ever. Tendril-like claws dragged the long, tattered cloak over the path towards him. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Pushing and pushing, this time the lever would not budge. Why had he not just left the gate open? With horror, Jaime watched her approach, scrambling forward between sadistic intervals as though to torment him in his final moments. There was no point now. This would be it. They were real, and he a fool to have summoned them here as he did. His mind turned to his mother. The years he had listened to her stories, arrogantly dismissing them as nonsense, simple tales used to discipline unruly children. Now he realized how right she had been all along. Shame welled up inside him, quickly surpassing all his fear. Diving into his pocket, he pulled out the rosary beads once more, thrusting the cross forward into the creature's face. Seething, the witch let out a sharp hiss and made into the air, her cape draping through the inky night. The gate swung open. Stunned, Jaime thanked the divine for what appeared to be a personal intervention in his safety. Between jumps, he sprinted down the steps and onto the orange-bathed road, the journey seeming much shorter than it had before. Bolting, he found the car still parked where it was. Nothing had changed, despite everything he had witnessed. Jaime swung open the door, throwing himself inside. "You all right? You were gone ages," asked Guzman, concerned. Nodding, Jaime tied the rosary beads around the rearview mirror and slammed the car door shut.